Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Will Fain, US Marshal, Book 4, by R.O. Lane. Narrated by A.T. Chandler. 1. El Paso, Texas, 1878. Will Fain sat in La Cantina de Miguel, in the Mexican barrio of El Paso, eating beef and cheese enchiladas with strong Yucateca beer and enjoying the festive atmosphere. A trio of guitarists was playing in one corner, and several caballeros and damas were dancing near the trio. Will was the only gringo in the place, but Miguel, a very congenial host, had made him feel welcome. Will had a table in the back corner where he could observe everything. Before Will had left his home in San Angelo, he'd been advised by Del Cole, one of his ranch hands and also a deputy US Marshal, to visit La Cantina de Miguel. So, when Will had arrived in El Paso by stage earlier that day, he'd walked over to the cantina. He'd been 5 days traveling from San Angelo to El Paso, and 5 days of eating stage station food was enough to make any man yearn for something better. Will had left San Angelo following the trail of Dick Muller, sometimes called Pie-Eyed Dick. It was said that Dick Muller was one of the friendliest and most polite men you'd ever meet, when he was sober. When he was pie-eyed drunk, he was likely to beat his own mother to death. On one of his drunks in San Antonio, he'd killed 2 deputy US Marshals who had tried to take him into custody for rustling cattle. After murdering the Marshals, Muller had fled across the Rio Grande into Mexico, but later had been seen in El Paso living quite openly. Judge Thomas H. Duval, the presiding federal judge for West Texas, had grown frustrated when U.S. Marshal J.P. Theder in San Antonio didn't seem interested enough in catching Muller. Duval had telegraphed Will in San Angelo, asking him to go to El Paso and bring Muller back, dead or alive. Duval was a law and order judge who always preferred that his marshals bring killers back alive so that he, the judge, had the pleasure of sentencing them to hang. To Will, it didn't matter. If he brought Muller in alive, it would please the judge, but if Muller didn't want to come back alive, Will would be happy to send him to hell. Will reflected that if he himself had a choice of hanging or dying from a gunshot, he'd take the bullet every time. Will was sure, however, that Muller had other ideas, like not dying at all. Usually, Will was accompanied on his manhunts by Chief Deputy Isum Wood, but Isum and Del Cole were pursuing a killer named Esteban Ruiz in Lincoln County, New Mexico territory. Ruiz had a gang involved in cattle and horse theft, and the gang had a fondness for killing whoever got in their way. So Will decided to pursue Pie-Eyed Dick by himself. He had confidence that Isum and Del would get the job done in Lincoln County. Will's thoughts were interrupted when a man stepped between him and the guitarists, blocking his view. He was a big man, dressed in a black broadcloth suit. He had a full black mustache and wore a gambler's low-crowned black hat. "Are you Marshal Fain?" the stranger asked. "Yep, that's me. What can I do for you?" Will realized that the music had stopped and Miguel was hovering close by, hoping there wouldn't be any trouble. "Been following your trail a while. What you can do for me is to get up from the table. You and me got something to settle." Will looked up at the stranger and said, "I'm eating my supper right now, and I'd appreciate it if you'd quit blocking my view. You're getting the people here all upset. Go outside and I'll meet you out there when I've finished my supper." The stranger pulled his coat back and undid the hammer thong that held his Colt in place. He smiled tightly and said, "If you're not standing up right now, I guess you can die right where you sit." "Oh, man. Look at all these people," Will said. "I don't want to have to kill you here in the restaurant. Let me buy you supper." The man laughed and said, "Are you afraid to face me? You ought to be." Will took a deep sigh and said, "Underneath the table, I'm holding a Webley Bulldog. It's a 5-shot 44 caliber revolver and it's pointed right at your cojones. My advice to you is walk out of here and live a little longer." Will noticed a tick at the left eye of the man. His sunburned face had paled, and his eyes were slits. He no doubt wanted to take a peek under the table to be sure. Finally, he chuckled and said, "You ain't got nothing under there. You're bluffing." Will shook his head before saying, "I'm not bluffing, Mr. Whoever you are. Remember, there's no second chances. You only get to roll the dice once, and you're betting your life on the throw. It's a stupid bet." "I'm sending you to hell right now," the stranger said. "Don't do it," Will said through gritted teeth. The man's hand dropped to his Colt and Will squeezed the trigger twice, hitting the man in the belly. The stranger hadn't even gotten his Colt out of the holster. The salty stink of gunpowder and smoke filled the air. The cantina was deadly quiet. Will rose from behind the table and knelt beside the man, who was on his back on the floor. "Why?" Will asked. "You killed my brother when the posse came from Fort Griffin." The man gasped and clutched his belly. Will remembered the incident well. 4 years before, Will's thoroughbred Traveler had won a race at Fort Griffin, and Will had bet heavily on the race and won. He collected his winnings right after, and he and Isum had left for home. Some of the men who'd lost heavily on the race decided to follow and get their money back. Will and Isum had ambushed them and killed several. "What's your name?" "Hotchkiss. Donald Hotchkiss," he said as he grimaced. Will stood and turned to Miguel. "Have someone run for the doctor," Will told him, even though he knew there was no hope. "But Senor Marshal, he shot in the belly. Ain't nothing no doctor can do," Miguel said. "You're right, but get the doctor anyway. An Anglo doctor if you can." Miguel spoke to a young boy, and he ran out of the cantina. A few minutes later, the doctor came through the door. He knelt by the moaning man on the floor without saying a word. He removed Hotchkiss's hands from his belly and looked at the 2 bullet holes. Everyone in the place heard the doctor expel a long, deep breath. The doctor reached into his bag and took out a blue bottle with a cork stopper. "Hold the man's head up," he commanded. Miguel and another man nearby lifted Hotchkiss's head, and the doctor removed the cork and poured some of the liquid into the wounded man's mouth. Between moans, Hotchkiss swallowed, and the doctor gave him one swig after another. Standing, the doctor said quietly, "That's all I can do for him. The laudanum will ease his pain a little, but he'll be dead in a few minutes. Tough way to die." A moment later, a deputy city marshal came in, and folks moved aside as he shouldered his way toward Hotchkiss, who lay moaning on the floor. "Miguel, what happened here?" "This man here," Miguel said, pointing down to Hotchkiss. "He came into the cantina and called out the marshal, who told him he had him covered with a pistol under the table. The man don't believe him. He drew, and the marshal shot him twice." The deputy squinted at Will and asked, "What kind of marshal are you?" "United States Marshal for the Western District of Texas," Will said. "You mean deputy marshal, don't you?" "If I meant that, I'd say that. I'm US Marshal Will Fain. This man challenged me and I shot him. He says I killed his brother a few years ago, and maybe I did." "I'm Norm Stotts, Deputy City Marshal here in El Paso. You'll have to come with me so I can make out a report on this," he said. "I'll come in tomorrow if I have time. You don't need me to fill out your report," Will told him. "I can't tell you any more than you've already been told. The man's name is Donald Hotchkiss." "Well, hell," Stott said. "I guess you're right." The doctor, who'd been kneeling beside Hotchkiss, stood and said, "He's gone. I'll send for the undertaker." "How soon can the undertaker get him out of here?" Will asked. "The sooner the better. Miguel needs to get back to business." "I already sent for him, Senor Marshal. He should be here soon," Miguel said. "Meanwhile, Miguel, let's get a couple of men to carry the body outside. Then you can resume business, and maybe I can finish my supper," Will said. "I'm sorry about all this. Didn't mean to bring trouble to your cantina." 2. Will spent a pleasant night in the Hotel Paraíso. The following morning he walked down to the Café Grande, which had been recommended by the clerk in the hotel. It was breakfast time and the restaurant was almost full, but he was seated at a corner table and ordered bacon, eggs, fried potatoes, and biscuits. A young waitress brought the food, and Will started eating. Everything was perfect, until he heard the restaurant door open and 4 loud-mouthed men walked in, led by a brutish-looking, red-faced man with a big paunch. The man surveyed the room and couldn't find a single table. Will turned back to his breakfast before realizing the big man was coming over to his table. "Hey, buddy, we need that table. You can finish your meal somewhere else." Will looked up and took a chomp off a piece of bacon he was holding between the fingers of his left hand. "No, I have an attachment to this table." The big man edged up to the table, looked over his shoulder, and smiled at his 3 grinning friends. He turned back to Will and said, "What attachment would that be?" "My food's on it," Will said. "Son, you don't understand. I want that table. Now if you don't get up, me and my boys gonna throw you out of here." Will dropped the bacon strip back on his plate, pushed his chair back from the table a little bit, then smiled at the big man. He started stabbing with his finger. 1, 2, 3, 4 of you," Will said, shaking his head. "That's not enough to throw me out." The big man looked like he'd been slapped. He clamped his jaw and said, "Okay, boy. You asked for it." He reached for Will, but stopped when he found himself staring at the wrong end of a Colt .44 that appeared in Will's hand as if by magic. Will stood and pushed the Colt forward until it touched the man's head. "What were you saying?" Will asked. The big man swallowed hard. "I guess I'll find another table." "Yeah, I guess you will. In another restaurant," Will told him. "Now get out of here before I get upset." Will dropped his Colt back into the holster. The big man, trying to save face, said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" "Yeah, I know exactly who you are," Will said. "You're a jackass who thinks he owns this restaurant and probably this town, and I don't want to see your ugly face again." "I'm J.T. Hemsley. You remember that name. I got the biggest spread in all of El Paso, the Circle H, and you'd do well to remember that." "You got a big spread, all right. Around your belly. Now get out of here, you're upsetting the patrons," Will said. Hemsley gave him a long stare before elbowing himself through his men and walking out. When the door clanged shut, the other patrons began clapping. Will shrugged his shoulders, sat back down, and resumed eating, but wondered about his new enemy. Some people just didn't know how to behave in polite society. After the meal, Will walked back to his hotel. He sat on the porch enjoying a cigarillo. He rarely smoked and never around his family, but when on a manhunt, he indulged once in a while. He was thinking about how he was going to capture Pie-Eyed Dick. He'd hoped to keep a low profile, but he'd already killed one man and made an enemy of the biggest rancher around. He supposed before the day was out, Pie-Eyed Dick would know a US Marshal was in town, and he'd probably figure that Will had come to bring him in. And what Pie-Eyed Dick would do was go across the Rio Grande into Mexico, and he'd think he was safe. What he didn't know was that Will didn't respect the border. When he was after a killer of US Marshals, he'd put his badge in his pocket and go right across the border and bring the killer back, dead or alive. And he didn't much care what the Mexican government thought about it. Over the last 4 years, he'd bought some books and made a conscious effort to learn the Spanish language. And he often practiced with Isum, who'd learned the language while in the army and stationed in West Texas. Sometimes on their manhunts, Will and Isum would speak nothing but Spanish, so Will was fairly proficient with the language now after living in West Texas for 6 years. Will finished his smoke, then wandered over to the city marshal's office. He didn't know the city marshal, but he thought he ought to get acquainted and advise the local peace officer what he was doing in town. He opened the marshal's office door and saw a deputy sitting at a desk. Will asked if the city marshal was in. The deputy marshal yelled, "Marshal, man to see you here." A tall man, dressed impeccably in tight dark pants, hickory shirt with tiny stripes and string tie, came out of an office at the rear. "Help you? I'm US Marshal Will Fain from San Angelo. I'm hunting a man named Dick Muller, sometimes called Pie-Eyed Dick. We heard he's here in El Paso. Have you heard anything about him?" "What's he wanted for?" the marshal asked. "Among other things, murder," Will said. "Murder? Who'd he kill?" Will gave the marshal a steely-eyed look. The marshal didn't have the courtesy to introduce himself, but Will didn't want to antagonize him. "He killed 2 U.S. deputy marshals in San Antonio." "Is that right?" Will had had enough. "Yeah, that's right. Have you heard anything of him around here?" The tall marshal ran his hand down his jaw before saying, "Nah, I don't guess we have." Will turned and, as he opened the door to leave, said, "Nice to meet you, Marshal. Maybe next time you'll have the courtesy to introduce yourself. Before leaving, I'll give you some advice. Don't interfere with me in any way. You'd best give your deputies that same message." "Or what?" the marshal asked. Will slowly shut the door and walked back and faced the marshal. Will thought he may as well settle this right now. This city marshal had to know not to fool with him. Will reached out and put his index finger on the marshal's chest and poked him hard with each word. "Or you will rue the day." The marshal was so surprised he dropped the paper in his hand and attempted to slap Will's hand away. He stepped back, anger clear on his face, and started to draw his Colt, but stopped dead still, a look of alarm on his face, when he saw the Colt appear in Will's hand about 3 inches from his nose. "You're way too slow, Marshal." The city marshal straightened up and moved his hand away from his sidearm. Will dropped the Colt back into his holster. "I'll be leaving now, but make no mistake. I'm here to do a job, and if that means I have to step on you to do it, I'll be delighted. And if I need help, I can go to Fort Bliss and come back with a whole company of cavalry. I've also got 2 deputies that can be here in no time at all. If we have to, we'll shut your office down and tell the town they have to appoint somebody else, or I'll appoint somebody else. I have the authority, don't doubt it." Will backed up, opened the door, and emerged into the sunlight. The whole experience with the city marshal made Will wonder. Seems like the marshal knows Muller and is protecting him, he thought. He walked down to the corner and secreted himself in a doorway so that he could watch the marshal's office. A few seconds later, the deputy came out of the office and walked quickly down the street. Will followed on the other side of the street. The deputy entered the Bull's Head Saloon on El Paso Street, just beyond El Centro. Will walked across the street, dodging a loaded supply wagon. He approached the saloon and looked in a corner of the window. The deputy was speaking to a well-dressed man with a pencil mustache and a full head of graying hair. They spoke for some time, then the well-dressed man turned, and Will could read his lips perfectly. "I'll take care of him." Will smiled, walked down the boardwalk and into the saloon. He walked up to the bar, ordered a beer, and stared at the deputy and his well-dressed friend. "Just how are you going to take care of me?" Will asked as he took a swig of his beer. "Little early for beer, but I needed to confront you." He took another swig of the beer and raised his eyebrows. "I need an answer. Just how do you intend to take care of me?" The deputy stepped back and the man stepped forward. "I'm Harlan de Plains. I own the Bull's Head, and we take care of every need here, Marshal. What else can we do for you?" "You know a man named Dick Muller?" Will asked. "Why, yes, I do. Matter of fact, I had to kick him out of here the other night. Got drunk and started 2 fights, knocked one cowboy's tooth out. Dick is a dangerous drunk. Your city marshal, what's his name? Nate Foster, DePlain said. Yeah, he just told me he'd never heard of Dick Muller. How is it that Muller caused all this trouble and never came to the attention of your city marshal? Will asked. Well, I don't have the answer to that, DePlain said. Will turned to the deputy and asked, What's your name? Giles Lambert? Can you explain to me how Muller can cause so much trouble and Foster doesn't even know the man? Will asked. I think maybe Marshal Foster just didn't understand what you were talking about, Lambert said. So, Foster does know him? Will asked. Well, I really can't say, but Muller has been in jail before, Lambert said. Mr. DePlain, as I'm sure Deputy Lambert has already informed you, I'm Will Fain, US Marshal, and I'm here to arrest Muller and take him to San Antonio for trial on a charge of murder. You know where I can find him? I'm not sure, DePlain said. But last I heard, he was working for J.T. Hemsley. Will laughed out loud, then took another swallow of beer. This is going to be some shindig. I met Hemsley this morning. Quite a man, isn't he? He thinks he owns everything he sees, and he thinks everyone should move aside when he passes, DePlain said. I figured that out after I met him this morning, Will said. Now I want to ask you one more question. Will stared right into DePlain's eyes. And don't tell me a lie because I'll know. Will took another swallow of beer and let his remark sink in a little. After my run-in with the city marshal this morning, within seconds of me leaving the office, this deputy left the same office and trotted right down here to speak with you. Why is that? DePlain licked his lips, then laughed. Our city marshal gets a little extra money from me for keeping me informed about what's going on in town. The city doesn't pay him much, so I pay him a little extra on the side. Will stared at DePlain. That is lame. One of the lamest stories I ever heard. Surely a man of your intellect can come up with something better than that. DePlain laughed again. It may be lame to you, but it's the truth. Marshal Foster is on my payroll for a little extra cash, and he keeps me posted on what's going on in town. When a United States Marshal comes to town, that's news, and I like to be one of the first to know. Are you afraid of being investigated? Will asked. No, it's not that at all. I just like to be kept informed, DePlain said. Will placed his beer glass on the bar, all the while staring at DePlain. Now I'm coming back to my original question. How are you gonna take care of me? I told you. I run the saloon, serve fine liquors, and offer honest games of chance. I also have an arrangement with Annie's down the street. We take care of any man's most, shall we say, his most urgent needs, DePlain said. And I can take care of yours, Marshal. Will stared straight at DePlain for several seconds before saying, Let's get one thing straight. I don't need anyone to take care of me or my needs. I can take care of myself. I'll give you the same warning I gave the city marshal. Don't interfere in my business. If you do, I'll shut this place down, and you too. Now, Marshal, there's no need for threats. I'll help you in any way I can. I'm a law-abiding citizen, DePlain said. Really, Will said as he walked over to an unattended roulette table and felt under the edges all around. Then he flipped the roulette wheel over, and it hit the floor with a loud clatter. "What's the purpose of this button right here?" Will asked as he pointed to a small push button on the underside of the table. DePlains turned white. I don't know. What is it for?" "It permits the operator, the croupier he's called, to slow or stop the wheel whenever he wishes. Is that what you call an honest game of chance?" DePlains stared at Will. "I don't know what to say. I know you won't believe I didn't know that button even existed." Will laughed and said, "You're right about that. I don't believe you. I could arrest you right now. Instead, I'll give you some advice. Don't use that wheel again, or any other wheel that's rigged. You've been warned, and I only warn once." DePlains watched as Will walked out the door. After Will was out of earshot, DePlains looked over at his bartender and said, "Henry, get Shiloh for me. I got a job for him." Henry untied his apron, threw it on the bar, and headed out the back door. A few minutes later, Shiloh Hawkins walked into the Bull's Head, saw DePlains, and walked over to him. "You wanted me, Harlan?" "Yeah, Shiloh. Come into my office. We got a US Marshal in town looking for Dick Muller. He came in here and busted me for my rigged roulette wheels. You better get around to the other saloon owners and let them know he may be calling on them. Go first to the Gold Nugget and warn the little man, then the others. They can take whatever precautions they deem necessary." "I thought Nate Foster had that all in hand," Shiloh said. "Nate's weak, and this US Marshal knows it," DePlains said. "My fear is that he'll talk to the town council and tell them to replace Nate. Then they'll hire somebody we can't control. And I bet I know what you're really afraid of," Shiloh said. "Yeah, you do. I don't want it to get out where we're getting the Mexican gals," DePlains said. "If he heads down into Mexico, he might hear some complaints. No. He's a U.S. Marshal. Can't go into Mexico. We just have to control him while he's here in town," DePlains said. 3. Will walked out of the saloon and thought he must be losing his patience. He seemed to have confrontations with everybody he met. But he'd been a U.S. Marshal for several years now, and he just wasn't putting up with nonsense from anybody. His job was like turning over a rotten piece of wood. You always found decay and undesirable critters underneath. Leaving the saloon, he walked up El Paso Street to the Antonio stables. He saw a hostler at a work table repairing a bridle and asked, "You have horses for sale?" "Oh, sí, señor. I have many horses. My name is Antonio Vargas. You can go into the corral and see. I can sell or rent as you prefer." "I'll buy. Then I'll have a horse whenever I need him, and he can be stabled here when I'm in town," Will said. "Have you got an apple or a lump of sugar?" Antonio went into the stable and came out with a small shriveled apple. Will cut it in half and walked into the corral. All the horses started milling around and moving away but one, a handsome black gelding, just stood and looked at him. Will held out his hand with half of the apple in it and walked slowly toward the gelding, speaking very softly. He got close and the black took the half of apple, ate it, then came back to the hand for the second half. Will rubbed his forehead, which had a white star. "Okay, boy, your name's Star, and you and I are going to be good friends." Will asked Antonio what he wanted for the horse. Antonio told him $80. Will knew he could dicker and get the horse cheaper, but he didn't bother. He paid and bought a used but serviceable saddle and bridle. He saddled the horse and rode out of town toward the east. He was very pleased when he rode Star. The horse had a very easy stride that made Will think he was in a rocking chair. Using Vargas's directions, Will had no trouble finding the headquarters of the Hemsley Empire. Approaching the lane leading to the ranch house, Will saw a giant...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?